I will say, preliminarily, as it were, that I am rather ill. In fact, rather thoroughly ill, and I don't have a very thorough note sheet or anything. And as soon as this is done, I'm going to be going to bed. But I have read this book several times. It is near and dear to me, so I think I'll be able to give a decent enough picture of it, whether or not I have all the everything arranged perfectly or all the phraseology for you. I think I'll give you a pretty good picture. I don't know. Should I? I don't know. I don't know if I should abuse my infrastructure elsewhere. I don't know if I should. I should probably be tread lightly, as they say. But I guess I could begin. I'll start. Well, I'll say the title of the book might give you a narrower impression than it really deserves. It's basically a broad sketch of Spengler's ideas of evolution, or if you like, cosmology in general. It's really the portion spent to merely the narrow question of human technics, which is to say, I don't know if casually in English, if I can give a very concise definition of that, but he calls the tactics of living essentially the uniquely human severance from nature, which obviously in our case is best exemplified by primitive tool making, but which is reflected in a primitive form in all forms of animal life. But his focus isn't necessarily narrowly even within those bounds. The entirety of human, animal, cultural, even pre-cultural and civilizational evolution is given his attention. So it, in a sense, is kind of a primer for his post-mortem notes. There's a book, I forgot the name of it. I think it's something world prehistory. I forget now, but there's like 1,000 pages of his post-mortem notes that are very interesting. His thoughts on the Neolithic and on the various pre-cultures, on aspects at a deeper level of human and cosmological evolution, which he didn't touch on in Decline of the West, which was somewhat of a narrow work, focused, of course, obviously on the developed forms of human civilization. But anyway, this is kind of like a primer to that. This is kind of a broad opening to his later thought, which unfortunately, as you could say in the case of Nietzsche, with the will to power, didn't really get its final expression. Maybe that's a uniquely German tendency. His first sort of overly confident steps with Decline of the West never really got their full extrapolation and contextualization as he would have liked to give it. He even backstepped on some of his fundamental views. In Manatechnics, you do see a sort of more linear and universal view as to human culture and evolution, and you see that especially in his notes. Did I say post-death? But anyway, the notes that were published, after his death, it took, I think, decades for them to be compiled and finally released. But at any rate, he does come closer to a more linear and universal view. He's not strictly concerned with the intellectual evolution of man narrowly within the developed high cultures. And you see a progression in this direction in his thought, from Manatechnics to Hour of Decision, and then to those unpublished notes. You see this gradual progression to more universal, all-encompassing sort of cosmological theory. So anyway, I guess I should take it in the direction from the macrocosmic to the microcosmic, and following chronologically his sort of view of evolution. Now, his view of the cosmos itself is essentially Nietzschean. Of the unliving world, he ascribes to the planets and their motions a kind of godlike unconcern. He speaks of the essential meaninglessness of our small planet and the happenings thereon. And while that may sound familiar to you from a sort of libtard point of view, a sort of libtard metaphysics. In this case, his view is entirely Nietzschean. The sort of absence of meaning within a broader cosmological scheme is tragic rather than optimistic, you may say. In the Reddit point of view, the world is a blank slate and we can endlessly improve upon it and achieve a state of desirable, minimal suffering, maximal comfort for human beings. But in the Nietzschean or Spenglerian point of view, it is an actual nihilism. It is an actual embrace of the fundamental meaninglessness of cosmological happenings. But of course, within this broad scheme, there is life. And within the being streams, within the courses of life itself, the cosmic streams, he has a variety of sort of almost mystical sounding phrases. There is a meaning within organisms and within their life courses. Of course, this book was composed in the early middle 20th century, so the evolutionary picture was not nearly as fleshed out or fundamental as our own. He doesn't begin with RNA or anything naturally. He just kind of leaves the origins of life itself as a mystery. But within this essentially meaningless universe, life emerges somehow and gradually attains to higher, or I should say rapidly, within a very long time span, very mysteriously evolves into higher forms of life. He takes the sort of vitalistic Nietzschean view that evolution is essentially self-governed. It is an act of will. The development of new organisms is essentially immediate and non-Darwinian. But anyway, his scheme of life itself is sort of classical. You might say that of plant life, or I suppose to contextualize, from the outset he denies the Darwinian picture, the sort of anatomical classification of life according to genealogical descent. He instead describes it according to soul. He outright uses the word soul, not so much of the vague abstract language of his previous works. The soul of vegetative life as opposed to the soul of herbivoric life, as opposed to the soul of carnivoric life. You might say an eagle has more in common with a lion than a lion does with a stag, or an eagle with a smaller bird which acts as prey. But anyway, life classified according to soul emerges from the plant form to the herbivoric to the carnivoric, obviously. And with each development, there is an increasing freedom from nature, from the essentially blind and meaningless courses of nature. The carnivoric forms of life are the first to impose meaning upon themselves and on the world around them. They are the first to not only attain a sort of activity independent of nature, but to be forced to impose form on themselves and on nature around them. There is essentially a sentience in the carnivoric preying form of life which does not exist in prey. There is a severance. There is, in the symbol of the two eyes on the front of the face, there is the separation of objects in the field of view. There is a fundamental hatred of what is once equal and a looking down on all else, which results in the first independence of soul from, as I said, the sort of meaningless courses of nature. And from this basic carnivoric type, naturally emerges man, which he takes as the highest form, the highest beast of prey. Man expresses all the potentialities which existed previously in all other carnivoric forms of life. He is very generous to the nobler forms of animal. They essentially contain every potentiality as man. Architecture exists among insects. The forms of property, dispute, inner politics exist among the higher forms of preying animal. Essentially, everything which is expressed in man, even the use of tools, is expressed to a degree in the various forms of carnivoric life. But anyway, what separates man is technics, as opposed to what he describes as generic technique, which is the war of all against all within the universe. Man alone severs himself by an active technics, as opposed to a generic species-based a generic species technique. I don't know if there's a very good English separation of those words. I suppose it might sound vague to you, but I imagine in the German there's a more sort of fundamental distinction there. But suffice to say, among the animal forms of life, say the bee, the form of the beehive has essentially existed in his view as long as the bee itself has. But with man, there is alone the development of the forms of technics independently. Individual men can separate themselves from the genus. There is a fundamental separation there, which he symbolizes in the first kindling of fire, the fundamental abstraction of inorganic forces away from the womb of nature. But anyway, this development in man essentially exists in his view for tens of thousands of years meaninglessly. There is essentially, no progression. That's the basic Darwinian view as well. But according to Swedish archaeology, he takes, or I should begin, I guess, with his definition of man itself. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit disorganized. As I said, I am rather ill at the moment. But I did want to provide you with something instead of leaving you hanging for several weeks. So bear with me. I do apologize if this is disorganized. But his definition of man, the fundamental symbol of his separation, is the hand, which he takes as emerging essentially contemporaneously with the tool. He says there is no such thing as the hand without the tool, or the tool without the hand, and that the kind of linear developmental scheme is just an abstraction in the minds of scientists. There's no evidence in the evolutionary record of one without the other. And again, as I said, his view of evolution fundamentally is one of leaps and bounds, which occur essentially meaninglessly and immediately. That is what the fossil record itself points to. New forms of life, new organs within the same species. These things tend to develop almost immediately. There is no specific evidence. Maybe some Darwinians will get angry with me, but from what I'm aware of, from what I've seen, there is no evidence of like the gradual turning of an arm into a fin, or of a leg into a fin in the forms of amphibious life. It's just kind of assumed that because at one point there is a leg and at another point there is a fin, there had to have been tiny intermediary gradient stages. But Spengler's view, and that of I believe a small fraction of dissident scientists, is essentially that given the evidence, or given the absence of evidence for this, that there is, it's a bit much to stake an entire evolutionary theory on that kind of grounds. There's nothing evolutionarily beneficial about these intermediary forms. There's nothing like a half fin, half leg thing, to harp on that point a little bit, is no more beneficial in either environment. It's not more beneficial than a leg on land, and it's not more beneficial than a fin in the water. It serves neither purpose. It wouldn't be selected for positively under any circumstances. And then, of course, you have the outright seemingly impossible examples. I think Bapp and Schopenhauer use like flying squirrels, and there's those parasites that hijack the brains of insects and make them drown themselves. Anyway, suffice to say, he takes the sort of vitalistic Nietzschean dissident scientist view, the sort of Rupert Sheldrake kind of view, that things progress according to will. They progress according to themselves. The emergence of species is essentially a mystery, and they keep entirely within their own form for the entirety of their evolutionary lifespan. And then they either disappear or they become something else entirely. Whether that's within the same, of course, generally it's within the same genus. Generally, a tiger is going to become a different form of tiger, but there doesn't seem to be this very gradual, slightly different stages, slightly different forms of different organs. he takes that as essentially lacking in evidence. But anyway, he applies that to man himself. He says suddenly the faculty of the hand of the, in the popular scientific discourse, you would say the opposable thumbs especially, but the unique form of the hand of man is what separates him from nature, and immediate with the hand is the tool. And as I said, the two are inconceivable without one another. The hand has no purpose without the tool. Obviously, the tool has no purpose without the hand. And so they must have emerged at exactly the same time, with no intermediary at all. So, because of course, a chimp with opposable thumbs has no particular advantage. Obviously, there's the techniques would have to exist simultaneously. So, at any rate, also on a side note, kind of a funny meme from 19th century archaeology. He takes essentially all the various forms of man as man. So he says, like, you could find a Neanderthal type in any city crowd today, which is kind of funny. Kuhn says the same thing. He has a little drawing of a Neanderthal man in like the bowler hat, and that's kind of funny. But that was the view back then, is that essentially all the forms of early man were man, and would be, and at least in the case of Neanderthals, would be would have an easy time blending in. So he doesn't confine man to Homo sapiens, it seems. But anyway, man emerges rapidly with the hand and with the tool for however many tens of thousands of years. He didn't believe in the scale of millions of years. It does seem he was somewhat proven wrong in that regard. Unfortunately for him, if we count Homo erectus and all those earlier forms, it would seem that he was wrong about that. But anyway, the second revolution in human evolution, the first, as I said, is the hand and the tool that go with it. The second revolution is language. Now, another Spenglerian hot take, and one which would either, should it be vindicated or not, will result in him being seen even more as a genius, or even more as a quack, I guess, for lack of a better word. A very hot take. He has plenty of hot takes like this. Is that language emerged simultaneously with the collective enterprise. In other words, grammatical, structured language emerged in the Neolithic with collective human enterprises, as opposed to the Paleolithic and the early Mesolithic, where human bands were essentially a collection of individual males. In the Neolithic, you have actual collective living. You have collective enterprises according to abstract schemes. You have roads spanning hundreds of miles, the erection of monuments, the planning of villages. For in the case of Romania, they had villages of thousands of people, spanning miles. All these sorts of complex enterprises. The invention of the cart is, of course, as being essentially concurrent with the invention of the road and with the wheel and everything else. Anyway, he says that basically all these things together signify the development of language, just as the tool or the hand signify each other's arrival. He says that language and collective doing according to scheme, or in other words, enterprise, or in other words, Neolithic economy, essentially belong together. And that is a very hot take. I'm not sure of any linguistic schools that adhere to that view, but I mean, I wouldn't count it as totally impossible if you narrowed the definition again to complex grammar, settled syntax, etc. It wouldn't be too surprising if there was some truth to that. So that would be very interesting to look into. But anyway, with the Neolithic, he places that at about 5,000 BC, very far off, but basically accurate for Northern Europe, which was his source was Swedish archaeology in that regard. Anyway, so 5,000 BC thereabouts, he puts the Neolithic. In reality, it was about 8,000 BC, you could say, or even 11,000 if you want to be generous. And then, of course, with 3,000 BC in the Near East, one has the emergence of high cultures and the beginning of basic Spenglerian theory, the solidified theory which he passed down to us, as opposed to that which is relegated to his personal notes, unfortunately, as I said. But anyway, the evolution of man, a fundamentally new course is taken with each revolution. As I said, first hand in the tool. Secondly, language and collective enterprise. And then with high culture, the language is further severed from its roots in immediate collective doing, the common understanding of workman and leader, the sort of communal belonging of the Neolithic period. It is, of course, separated then into abstract thought, into slavery to a far greater degree, into ruling and subject strata. Certain populations make contact with others, enslave them, and in the Nietzschean genealogy, this is taken as the origin of high culture. And in the Spenglerian sense, it's kind of implied. It's a little more linear in development, but he does say every settled peasantry is essentially enslaved to a class above it. And of course, that class has to have had a foreign origin of sorts. So he does kind of adhere to the Nietzschean orthodoxy there. But anyway, the irony of the development of civilization is that whereas in the Neolithic period, there was a minimal yielding of personal freedom. I don't completely agree with this, but this is his picture, by the leaders to the society that they led. With high culture, there is an increasing subsuming of all human life by the means of the extension of power which it created. So ruling classes are bound with, individuals are bound with their class, classes are bound with their state, and so on. The human being finds himself increasingly entrapped in the forms of his own creation. He finds himself increasingly severed from nature, and in an almost mystical process, the high cultures vampirize the human material which they are given. And this, again, this isn't so much of a Darwinian process as, again, being he adheres, as I said, to a sort of vitalistic view. He outright uses the word soul, as I said, as opposed to Decline of the West. He is a little bit more explicit. But there's an essential vampirism of the high cultures in their severance from the being streams of nature upon the human material which they utilize. He gives the essential symbol of this, the primitive symbol of this condition, is the human house, which acts essentially as a prison for the beast of prey nature to which man belongs. And anyway, so this course, of course, as I said in the last ABC, is played out from south to north, from the sort of placid civilizations nearer to the equator northwards. Each falls into ruin. Each falls into philohdom. Finally, until our north, our Faustian north, which wherein the separation of man from nature and of technics from man reaches its zenith. In our case alone, is the entirety of the planet threatened by our own inventions. In our case alone, do our inventions, in a sense, assume a fundamentally independent character, even from our own civilization, to the point of being a weapon which can be exported to the outer world. We are rather unique in his eyes as to the catastrophic fate we have laid out for ourselves. And again, the earlier picture I gave, you might think, oh, well, that's what libtards say. Well, this is also something that libtards like to say, but it's also true. The right could just as easily be the party of ecology. Not that he's an ecologist, but he takes our civilization as fundamentally a threat to its own environment, but that at the same time, concerns in that regard are stupid, because by the time that we say run out of coal or whatever, our civilization will have already been exhausted, or new avenues would have already been discovered, and that, in all likelihood, we'll simply exhaust ourselves before we ever come to the point of, actually destroying the environment, though we will come near to it. Anyway, the progression of technics northwards, as I said, from the primitive forms of the slave labor, the erection of the pyramids and the ziggurats, to that of the classical, the Chinese, and so on, to our own, where the idea is essentially the rape of nature, the total severance of inorganic forces from the world which contained them. There is a kind of pantheism, he says, in the way in which we see inorganic forces fusing all things. There's almost it's almost the mysticism of certain monks of the 13th century who devised machines in their cells, this kind of reverence for the inorganic forces which God created and suffused in all things. It's only our culture which could have reached this fatal point. And with the expiration of our culture, so too will be the expiration of these techniques. The outer world which imitated them to use them against us will simply drop them or become incapable of maintaining them with our own disappearance. And he says we will face an increasing difficulty with even maintaining the bare minimum of our technical capacities, or of, let alone of expanding them, as greater minds are drawn away from practical pursuits, as the alienation of the human material increases, as great men find solace in mysticism, as he says. Surprisingly, he almost concedes the point of the appeal of a man like Evola. He says the great men of his own time increasingly find themselves lost in metaphysics and Hindu philosophy and nature and the hatred of techniques, just as the masses, the proletariat, increasingly finds itself alienated from the production wherein it is engaged and whereto it feels no direct connection. So, in a sense, again, he returns to his classical view that it is the human material and its own pursuits which matters more than anything. Libtards are wrong when they say we're actually going to destroy the planet or something, though we will do a great deal of damage. Our own capacities in this view will be completely exhausted by that point. There's no need to even think about that. It's basically pointless. Anyway, that's about it for my summary. I again apologize. I am, as I said, extremely ill. I couldn't even write notes down. I was just kind of writhing around most of the day. Sorry about that. I apologize. I will in the future. Maybe I'll redo this at some point in maybe a few weeks from now. I'll redo it according to scheme. Maybe not as a space, but as a video or audio or something. Because I do feel bad when I have these impromptu things. I don't I'd rather be more organized about it. But anyway, if anybody has anything else to add to this sort of tragic and heroic picture, I advise you to do so. And I will say, as a bit of Spenglerian advice, the Spenglerian consolation, he says we should be like Achilles. You know what? Nothing matters anyway, bro. He says you should be like Achilles. Choose the short life. Choose death, basically. Choose death. Why not? You're going to die anyway. Our civilization is going to end in some way. I mean, that is irrefutable. In some form, it's going to end. Why not choose death? Why not give everything and die? And I agree with that wholeheartedly myself. I don't know if my good friends have anything to add to that, but that's the kind of it's almost a consolation in that. That's a sort of note he ends on famously with the quote about the Roman soldier Pompey. So anyway, that was my sort of bare minimum. That was my chore. That was what I had to do to entertain you, because I would otherwise feel guilty. Because it's been a while, man. But anyway, you have anything to add? I don't know. My good friend, see my good friend there, but you know what? I wouldn't coax him out. I wouldn't coax my good friend out there because he might, I wouldn't want to do that because he's my best friend. Oh, there, he requested anyway.